relief to the public after the removal of fuel subsidies on May the 29th. The initiative seeks to provide alternative sources of fuel such as CNG and EV for vehicles, which will greatly benefit the public. Pi-CNG is not just a test phase, but a well-planned effort to promote the adoption of CNG for transportation, in line with the national policy on transportation already adopted. It also aims to implement the use of CNG from start to finish to reduce costs and carbon emissions. One of the key objectives of Pi-CNG is to decrease transportation expenses for Nigerians by making use of the cheaper gas alternative that is abundant but currently underutilized in Nigeria. Well, joining us in the studio is the CEO, Mesovest, a gas and trading expert and CNG trader, Tosin Thompson. Good morning. Thank you for joining us on TVC Breakfast.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Now, if you look at the papers this morning, it is said that the Standards Organization of Nigeria has approved 80 standards for CNG vehicles. And the question is, are we already on track, or is that the beginning towards a safer and alternative use of the CNG as proposed by the president?
I would say it's both.
Okay.
Right? Yes, we're on track. I mean, for the government to put such an initiative, and the government, driving policy in Nigeria, central arm of driving policy, for them to be focused on this initiative puts us on track. But we are on the beginning stage.
Okay.
Again, so when we talk about CNG, the realities on that is that, first of all, CNG is a compressed form of natural gas.
Yes.
Natural gas, Nigeria has excess reserves of it. We have over 1 trillion cubic meters of natural gas. So yes, I agree this is the right approach to focus on an available resource that is currently underutilized and focusing on the economies to yield benefits to Nigeria.
Right.
But to answer the question, we are at the beginning stage. Because yes, natural gas is available, but over 70% of natural gas has not been processed. Right? So where do we start from? And this is where the government has to look strategically on implementing this policy so it's executable in a time frame that limits the hardship on Nigerians.
I like the fact that you use the word strategically, because this is not the first time we have attempted, having this matter of compressed natural gas, turning our attention to it. In 2021, we talked about having about 1 million vehicles being converted to using compressed natural gas, but that was stalled. Now, when you're talking about strategy, even though we are on the first phase as it is, like you mentioned, what are you looking at?
Okay, so you have to look at the supply chain and the adoption of natural gas as the alternative fuel, right? So you mentioned in 2021, quite correctly, converting 1 million vehicles to convert to natural gas. But the question I'm going to ask you is, where are they going to get the CNG from, right? It has to be readily available, right? So you have to create a distribution network first, and then you have to create a supply chain infrastructure that supports that distribution network. And if that's not in place, it's not a switch of the button where, you say 1 million vehicles, let's convert immediately, and you expect them to readily get their gas. That's a defeating purpose, and that's what they learned. That's why it stalled. There are solutions to this, right? And I don't know how far we're going in this conversation, we're going to step into it, right? So I'm going to follow your lead on that. But on a high level, there are solutions to it. And when we say strategically, we've got to look at this as a phased approach, where we have the short-term implementation and execution, the medium-term, and the long-term, right? The short-term is, what can we do now to tackle what's on ground? People are hungry. Naira is depreciating against the dollar. Let's address that. How can CNG help in that regard, right? In issues of transportation, how can CNG help in that regard in bringing the cost of food down, which Nigerians will immediately benefit from? That's the short-term approach, which there is a solution, and I'll talk about that. Hopefully the government will adopt it. I'm sure they're thinking about it. And then there will be a medium-term approach, reducing local content, right? The processes, when you're issued licenses, the processes of getting a license to getting operational, right? That's another thing. What's the time frame, the bureaucracies that we should cut down from? And then fiscal policies. And when I say fiscal policies, which I'll get into later on, I'm not talking about fiscal policies in terms of government spending, because there are two parts of it, right? Fiscal policies with government spending, in my opinion, is in line with subsidies. And you know, without getting into the politics of things, when we're talking about government spending, a naira is not equal to a naira spent is not equal to the naira output. That's right. Without getting into all that. But there's a solution in terms of taxation, right? So processes, sectors that run businesses and a supply chain are taxed now. So what the government can do in terms of partnership is cut down that taxation or suspend the taxation to give the businesses, especially private investing companies, a breathing room to operate, right? Without the burden, let me not say burden, but without taxes in that instance. Suspend that, give them flexibility for growth, and then reintroduce it later.
All right, so yeah, we could talk about CNG for all we care. She, took us back to 2021 when we talked about this, converting 1 million. And then the reason why we are talking about this now, which you also mentioned, is because of the hardship that we have now. Is that to say that when we say something, we don't really follow it through? Because does the federal government, the government themselves, do they really understand the imperative of having the CNG on the ground? That's one. And how easily adoptable, or how can we easily adopt it? Many Nigerians understand the concept of the CNG itself, because a lot of people will always say, generally using gas is causing a lot of problem. So if you're using CNG, isn't that gas in my car, which could even go a poof, in no time? So
there are about 2 questions there, and I'm going to provide clarity. So I'll start with the latter, right? CNG is actually the safest gas out there for one reason: it's less dense than air. So compared to LPG, which is cooking gas, which is a composition of butane and propane, once that is more dense than air. So once that is released into the atmosphere, it settles. So if there's something that triggers an explosion, the gas is available there, and that's why you see the explosion. However, CNG, once it has an escape route, is less dense than air, so its escape route is directly to the atmosphere. That makes it cheaper than the other alternative. So it's actually proven that CNG is the safest gas out there. But to your point, when you say that, we've come up with all these, initiatives, which are brilliant ideas, and then months later, years later, we don't follow through. Yes, I would say that there's an execution problem. Because when you begin to execute, you have to bring different participants in the sector and in the supply chain together, and they all have to be in agreement. So the government has to be good with getting the right players that have their right interests together so that they'll profess solutions. That's number one. But number two, don't forget that sometimes when we put out this policy, it's a matter of urgency.
That's right.
So certain things are not properly thought through from the beginning to the end. Yes, CNG is a proper solution, but what's the infrastructure for CNG in place, and what's the plan to put that in place? That's number one. Number two, apart from the infrastructure to put it in place, what's the availability of the gas? As I mentioned earlier, about 70% of Nigeria's gas reserves, proven reserves, which is over 1 trillion cubic meters, 70% of that is not processed. So if I ask a question that's, okay, how do I process this and how do I bring that into the supply chain? Right? That means I have to put out licenses, give people licenses to now play on the upstream. But what's the process between giving the people licenses and then operating? So we have to reduce that bureaucracy and regulatory bureaucracy, the content, the pipelines for distribution we have to bring. But I look at all that as a medium to long-term approach. We got to think about it as this. We're in an emergency ward. If we use the healthcare, which I'm not too versed of, I'm just going to use this as an example, right? So if you use the healthcare industry and you have a patient that goes into the regular ward and goes to certain processes, let's check your BP first. Let's check your different things. Versus a patient that goes into the emergency ward. They throw all that away. It's not that those processes that have been put in the regular ward are not supposed, they are there for a reason. But when we come to emergencies, the first point of action is like we need to save lives. We are in that situation now, and the government realizes it. So if we need to save lives, the government has to have a focused approach to this strategy and say, let's cut a lot of all the bureaucracies and the red tape that gets content and delays the process of producing CNG, producing gas on the upstream, right? With government executable action, with the presidency, the office of the presidency directly spearheading this. Because a lot of, we will need to use the president's executive action to bypass the normal processes that have to take in place by our Constitution, right? The presidency has to say that, listen, we are in an emergency solution. We need to tackle inflation, and we can get into that, why inflation is, because of depreciation of the naira in relative to the dollar, right? There are ways we can bypass that. The government should now, and permit me, I'm trying to hold myself from going into details because I'm waiting for further questions as we go down the line, but I can just jump ahead and give a high level. Okay. So if we're talking about inflation as an example, we're talking about food inflation, right? Before the depreciation of naira, when we're talking about food in Nigeria, the thing we're talking about was wastage, right? In the process of transportation, in the process of storage, etc. Absolutely. All of a sudden, depreciation of the naira against the dollar, naira now official and unofficial rates well over 1,400. And then prices of food has gone up, right? So what's the main cause of that? Because of increase, we can deduct that it's because of the increase in transportation cost. If there's an increase in transportation cost, it's because of the increase in the fuels for the transportation vehicles. So you see how we're tying all this together. So if the government wants an action that is readily executable in a couple of months and not years, what they should do is target this initiative in the short term. And remember I said it has to be done in phases, and we're talking about the first phase. This is a short-term approach, and say, okay, yes, we're going to tackle food inflation. Because other effects of the depreciation of the naira against the dollar, let's assume that it's not impacting the food sector, because food was produced 6 months at the same capacity as it's produced now. Let's assume minimal more investments have been using US dollars to get the equipment to produce the food. So let's assume that the equipment that was used is currently being used now. The only missing outlier here is the price of diesel, is the price of PMS, which is for transportation. So the government should now say that, okay, I have this program that I'm running that is properly funded for private individuals to push out CNG as an alternate source of fuel. So let me focus that and work with the Ministry of Agriculture as an example and say that let's launch 300 trucks of 50-ton capacity to transport food interstate in Nigeria. And all of them will be running on CNG. Now, the benefits of CNG versus PMS. You know, if 75 liters of CNG can run over 800 kilometers. So if I load up a truck...
When you compare that to PMS, what would that give?
We're talking about, first of all, the price in terms of 6. So it's all about, okay, PMS is ready and available, so you can get as much as you want. So, but you're limited and constrained by the price that you pay for it, right? The infrastructure for PMS and diesel is ready and available, so that's not the problem. If your gas runs out, the diesel or PMS, you can stop, and there's a convenience factor and can load up. But there's a constraint with price. So when I'm saying there's a constraint with price, where we say per liter, we're talking about 1,600 of cost of diesel per liter versus 230 naira cost of CNG per liter, right? So if we now decide to get a CNG trucking vehicle and load it up with 700 liters of CNG, that can transport us easily from Lagos to Abuja and back.
Interesting. But now there are those who have said that perhaps we should adopt the LPG strategy for, the compressed natural gas as it is. What do you say to that?
When you say LPG strategy, there are many strategies, right? There's the good side and the bad side.
Really?
Yes. And I'll say the LPG strategy, we should be careful with that statement because the price of LPG right now has skyrocketed for the last mile, right? So it all ties in together. I know their intention when they say the LPG strategy, meaning that the infrastructure is readily available.
Right.
In filling stations that had PMS, there were LPG present. So yes, we would get there. It's a no-brainer. Wherever we have filling station, adopt the infrastructure in place in terms of the land that's strategically located for dispensing fuels, flammable fuels, for LPG and for CNG, we'll get there. But that's actually not the problem. The problem is in the supply of the gas itself.
What's the bottleneck there with the supply of the gas?
So
we don't have the structure. We don't have what really is the challenge?
Incentives for private companies to come in to produce gas. I mentioned earlier on your show that 70% of Nigeria's gas underground or wherever hasn't been processed. So what the government has to do, apart from specifically targeting certain sectors in the short term, in the medium term, first of all, give out the licenses which they have done. They gave it out to about 42 new companies to capture flared gas and process it. That's a good approach, right? But an article came in not too long ago, I can't recall, so I won't be able to reference it, where upstream participants that supply gas to the grid at a cap rate of about $2.6 wanted that increased to $5. So if we narrow in on that, there's no incentive for the private participants to come in and play because they are profit-driven. So if the government is going to cap it, and then there's no incentive for the private participants to come and play because the cap price does not cover the production cost, what the government should do that instead of subsidizing, and I'm very particular of the words I use, because when you say subsidize, that means the government is spending. The government should use fiscal policy, and specific part of the fiscal policy is reduction in taxes. Because in any process that runs in the government usually collects some sort of tax revenues. In terms of this partnership, the government should go into the producing fields and say, okay, I'm not going to tax you for XYZ, provided you supply this gas for local demand.
That's right.
That will reduce production costs. That will bring more investment into the upstream. That will increase the supply.
So with what we have on the ground, do you feel that we are kind of ready? Because I'm wondering if there is any successful case study that Nigeria can study from, and then be able to also, come to that CNG implementation in a very proper way and professional.
We are ready. In terms of execution, we got to be strategic. I think we're looking at things the wrong way. We're trying to paint the whole picture at once versus in a phased approach. In terms of the benchmark, look at India. I mean, you can't compare India to Nigeria in terms of proven reserves that we have, but they've successfully run a CNG program for their country, right? So we are ready in the terms of us not having any choice now. The price of diesel has skyrocketed because of depreciation of Naira. It's about 1,600 Naira per liter. If that's not enough disincentive to use diesel and look for an alternative source, particularly one that is available for 230 Naira per liter, I don't know what else is. So we are ready in that regard.
By saying 230 Naira per liter, is that a proposed
that's available now,
given to it, or what is being sold at?
That's what's being sold at. It's actually less. I like being conservative. It's 210 Naira per liter.
Okay.
And that's, I'm going to be specific. You can get it at Mowe at 210 Naira per liter currently, right? Versus 1,600. And the production output is the same.
So you're saying that typically there are some people who are already, using the CNG?
Absolutely.
Apart from, some government-operated...
Absolutely. Yeah. So my company, we at Mesoverse have already converted CNG vehicles, diesel vehicles, and PMS vehicles to CNG vehicles. Successfully converted. Filled them at the mother station. So let me just, on a high level, just describe the infrastructure process of CNG. Yeah. You have the mother station, which is a compressor plant that is connected to the pipelines. So they get that lean gas, which is the dry gas or methane from the pipes. It gets into the mother station where they compress it. So there's a discussion on, should we compress or should we liquefy, right? The difference is when you liquefy, you're able to get more volume, right? And that's why when you talk about exportation, it's usually LNG because it's liquefied, because it's all unit economics. At the end of the day, how much capacity can I export, which will cover my cost? The more volumes I can export, the better it is. So you won't typically hear CNG, which is compressed, being exported. Liquefied is 600 times the capacity of CNG, but it's a lot more expensive to put a liquefied plant, right? So again, this is where strategy comes in. When we talk about gas, EV is the holy grail. Yeah. But if we're talking about gas, and let's use what benefits Nigeria now, and which is that we have all this gas that sometimes we don't even know what to do with because we flare it. Yeah. Let's use that and push that into the productive process, right? So going back to your point, we compress this gas. Currently, we do in Mowe under a NIPCO facility. Ibeshe, It's not operational, but there's another mother station connected to the pipeline. And in partnership with the NNPC, there was another mother station that was just recently launched in Ikorodu, but it's not operational as well. So for where we are now, we do have the CNG to push through, to move us forward in this initiative. But now the question is, if we're going to adopt the last mile, that is me, you, and everybody else that is listening, to convert our cars into CNG, we're exponentially increasing the demand for it.
Absolutely.
And that is where the supply, which is 70% that's proven that is not tapped now, that's where that question comes in. So the government should kickstart that policy, that executable policy, to reduce the bureaucracy, to bring that in line, have private companies like mine get their oil fields, process the gas, capture flare gas, process it as well, either in terms of CNG, in terms of LPG, and get that running. But we can start now. The gas we have now can kickstart the process.
Because the question on the minds of some Nigerians is, we have been expecting this whole process to have kickstarted across the country. There are those who have even gone ahead, like you mentioned, to convert their vehicles, but there are also those who are still using liquefied natural gas as their alternative because perhaps they can't access the CNG gases. What's the danger for those who have decided to use liquefied as against? Because I've seen some persons put, the gas cylinders in their cars, and I'm wondering, really, is this what it is about? So talking about advocacy and creating awareness.
Yes.
What do we need to do with regards to that?
Run training programs. Let's put the facts out there. Reputable institutions like yours, which is the media, put experts out here like you're currently doing to educate the public. CNG is very different from LPG in one regard, right? LPG is less dense than air.
Right.
Right? So in the event of a leakage, the LPG sits, especially when there's no escape route. God forbid you have this in your car, it's sitting in your car, all you need is a trigger, an ignition, and it explodes. LPG is more dense than air. CNG is less dense than air. So as long as there's an escape route, and that's the key word, right? It is looking to go out into the atmosphere. And this is a fact, and you can fact check this. CNG is actually safer gas.
I'm talking about the atmosphere. We're in an era where we talk about the climate, the ozone layer, the climate change, the global warming, etc. So how does this key into the drive to, ensure that we save our climate? Is it not going to contribute to it? Because others are saying, you already said the holy grail is EV. So shouldn't we be talking about, going that route rather than talking about gas again?
So I learned the hard way where it comes to theory and when it comes to practicality, we have two different trajectories. Some things are nice to have been said, and some things are better to have been executed on, right? So if we're talking about climate change, you got to look at it as a journey. Without being a little controversial, without naming names, when the Ukraine war started with Russia, a few countries that were pushing climate, I've been in this business because we're raising funds under the Green Climate Initiative, and some countries said, we don't deal with any derivative of fossil fuels, and that's where, LPG, CNG fall in line, even though they are a cleaner energy source than diesel and kerosene. But they said, straight up, we want solar, we want wind, everything, but the cost of solar and wind right now does not make sense from an executable perspective, right? And those countries, immediately Russia-Ukraine war started, what did they do? They did not even fall back to LNG because Russia is the largest producer of gas. They went to fire up their coal mines.
Right.
This is a fact. So, as Nigerians, what we have to do first, right, in the vein of social corporate responsibility and global corporate responsibility, we have a journey in which we are working towards, right, which is fossil-less based fuel. However, we also have this proven reserve, right, that it's a lot cleaner than the alternative that we have on ground. So as the government rightly said, this is a transition, right? So in terms of climate initiative, yes, it is not the end all, the be all, the holy grail, but it's a transition to end all. Killing two birds with one stone. Number one, we're pushing out the cleaner energy, obviously cleaner than diesel and PMS. You can't even compare it. But even though it's still fossil-based, we have this proven reserve to, once we process, we put it down our supply chain and make it adaptable and economically productive. And then through that, once the world and Nigerians involved bring out technology to bring out the cost of alternate sources like fossil-less fuels, like solar, like wind, once we come up with a solution with that, then we transition all that. But having said that, let me quickly drop this. You see, Nigeria's problem is not the product, or it's not from the upstream as we're saying in the gas. The problem is in the distribution. Do we have the distribution network? Do we have the distribution infrastructure? So if we ignore the product being CNG and jump into EV, I'll just give you an example. If a delivery bike that is running on EV is supposed to pick up where he charged from the mainland and deliver on the island, and on his way on Third Mainland Bridge, he's saying that his battery is dying. And then on the island, there's no infrastructure to recharge. And don't forget, when he has to recharge, if he's charging, he has to wait 40 minutes. With delivery bike, we wait 40 minutes just to charge. No one would pick that up. So it all boils down to distribution infrastructure to make this readily available.
Right. I wanted you to perhaps shed more light on the third phase, because you mentioned that has to do with fiscal policies, and you didn't expatiate on that. I'm sure that the right persons are watching and might want to understand what you meant by fiscal policies and what you expect to see there.
So the government has the right idea. Right. They've set up the committees to spearhead this initiative. They've also pushed out licenses to companies that have applied for years. And I'm talking about the upstream processing of CNG now.
Right.
But now we have to go beyond that. Number one, there has to be a process to reduce the time it takes for you to get a license from the time it takes for you to become operational. And where does the government come in to support that, right? I'm very against subsidy approach, meaning where the government puts in money and gives you money into your operational process.
How long does it take to get a license?
It could take years. We're talking about years. But with the government stepping in and any PRC stepping in, they've actually given out licenses, about 42 licenses to capture fled gas. But there's still processes in between that. Okay, yes, you have the license to process fled gas. Now we have to operate. Let's bring that down to about 6 months. That's very aggressive. 6 to 8 months. So once you have done that, right, you're operating, you're captured, but the government is there. How is the government? Because we still need government help. If we are saying that we're dependent on the dollar, let's be honest. Even private investors are dependent on the dollar. If you give me a license, which I'm currently looking for as Mesovest, if you're giving me a license to capture fled gas, I have to buy the infrastructure, and it's going to cost a lot of money. Where will I get the infrastructure from? Most likely, I'll look outside Nigeria. There's an FX impact, right? So, or with this government program where they put funding, right, to support this industry, I'll also look into that and ask the government to give me some of this. As long as I am vetted and the government vets me, and these are keywords I'm using, the government has to monitor that these companies that were given these licenses are using it for operating capacity. And we are open for that. But once that happens, so what makes this a longer-term approach? So this is the medium-term I talked about. But what makes this a longer-term approach is that there's always an FX impact. And as you have seen the CBN, putting all their arsenals to fight this is going to take some time, right, in terms of the FX. And I don't want to go into, take this conversation away from gas, but on a high level, when we're talking about the FX impact, we're talking about, okay, how can we get into import substitution where we don't have to, as an example, the crude swap program, where we're taking crude out and then we're bringing in refined product and we have to depend on FX for that. But that's a longer conversation. Absolutely.
We have to leave the conversation here now. Tosin Thompson, CEO Mesovest, a gas and trading expert and CNG trader. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Still ahead on TV.